In this video, we'll talk about graphing linear equations using t-charts. And we talk about this word linear. This means we're talking about equations that will form lines when we graph them. So let's look at an example. And when we're talking about graphing with t-charts, this goes beyond linear equations. You can apply this to any equation where you've got y's and x's. So the idea is we make our t-chart, and we get to choose one of these two values, either an x or a y. Usually, the way most equations are written, it's easier to choose an x value, but sometimes it is easier to pick a y value. So just keep that in mind. We pick one and we solve for the other, because each one of these will form a pair. So when I pick an x value, there's only one y value that's going to work with the equation to make it true. So when we're graphing, it's a good idea to start with some easier values. So for myself, I usually pick 0, 1, 2, 3. I could keep going to 4 and 5 if I need to, but okay. I take this and I plug them in. So I take 0, for example. 2 times 0 makes 0, which means that y has to be 0. Then I go to 1. 2 times 1 makes 2. That means y has to be 2. 2 times 2 makes 4. Means y has to be 4, 6, so on and so forth. Now, it's also a good idea to plug in some negatives, because sometimes that can change depending on what kind of function you're looking at. So if we try negative 1, we'll get negative 2. Negative 2 will get negative 4. Negative 3 will get negative 6. So if we were to graph this now using our points, and remember, you got your x-axis going across, you got your y-axis going up and down. And I'm just making ticks to make it a little easier on myself. So we know it goes through 0, 0. Okay. Then it goes through 1, 2. It goes through 2, 4. 3, 6. And it'll go through negative 1, negative 2, if we're looking at the negative side, and then so on and so forth. Negative 2, negative 4, negative 3, negative 6. And it's going to make a line, even if it might not look it on mine, just because I'm not perfect at drawing my axes on these things. But we can see there's potential for a line there for sure, if nothing else. And that's how we would graph using a t-chart with one example. Now, let's take a look at a more complicated example and see how we'd go about it. So this one looks a little bit different. In this case, we have the x's and the y's on each side. Now, there's a couple of options here. You can either manipulate the equation in general first and then plug in points, or we can plug in points and solve. So I think if we were to manipulate, we could say, let's say we get y by itself. So 2y equals 6 minus 2x, for example. And then we could go from there. We could divide everything by 2. So y is going to equal 3 minus x. All three of these equations are the same thing. They all have the same graphs. They have the same t-charts. The same values work in them. So any of them can be used interchangeably. And it's useful to try and get one variable by itself. It doesn't always have to be y. It could be x in this case. And we could plug in points for x or y accordingly. So we could still plug them in here. We just have to do a little bit of algebra every single time. So if we plugged in a value for x, we'd have to solve for it like we would a number. So we'd have to do essentially this process that we've done in red over and over and over again. So I elected to just do it one time, albeit in general, so that we can use this equation. So let's go ahead and plug in some points using a t-chart. So we got our x and our y. Let's go ahead and just give ourselves some values. That'd probably be a good start. So let's plug in 0. If I plug in 0, 3 minus 0 is 3, so that means y has to be 3. And then 3 minus 1 is 2, 3 minus 2 is 1, 3 minus 3 is 0, 3 minus a negative 1 actually makes 4, 3 minus a negative 2 makes 5, and then minus a negative 3 makes 6. So then again, we make our t-chart, or not our t-chart, we make our coordinate grid. X going across, Y going up and down. Okay, so we have the point 0, 3 very first. That means I don't go anywhere on the X, or across, I go straight up to 3. There we are. And then 1, 2, 2, 1, 3, 0, and then we could see how that would continue. And then likewise, we're going to do the negative side. So negative 1, 4, then negative 2, 5, then negative 3, 6. And we can see again, this looks like it's going to form a line. And that pattern would continue, because we could just keep plugging in points as we go. So here's another example. It's a little more complicated, but the same ideas still apply. So you can either choose to solve every time by plugging in a value, or manipulate the equation to make it to where it's a little easier to plug points in. And then once you've got your t-chart, just plot the points and continue the trend line.